and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Mia Keene, and I'm a sophomore double major in political science and mathematics with minors in French and vocal music. I am proud to be a member of the Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs, networking with our special guests, and professional development opportunities. My involvement in the SAB has allowed me to participate in exclusive events from which I have learned an invaluable amount about our political landscape, history, and culture from a variety of perspectives. These experiences pair well with my role as a student senator for Student Veterans of America and my goals of working as a Foreign Service Officer. If you're interested in the Student Advisory Board and you're a student and you would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel, and you can also access videos of past programs by visiting the same channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have any questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming our director, Audrey Coleman.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Mia, for that warm welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening at the Dole Institute of Politics for our program in which we are happy to welcome back again our visiting fellow, Jerry Seib. Jerry has been in residence here with us for the last several weeks. Again, fortunate 2 years later. It's always a pleasure, and he's been hard at work out here in Kansas in many ways. Those of you who are Wall Street Journal subscribers will be able to enjoy his essay online right now and then in print on Saturday, The Bright Spots in the Doom and Gloom of Our Politics. And we're all looking for that, I'm sure. But you all are here, so you know that here at the Dole Institute, we're a bright spot in the political landscape. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the Simons family for making Jerry's ongoing fellowship possible. And as this is KU's homecoming week, it's especially nice to be able to showcase a KU alum, distinguished KU alum here for this evening's program, The Growing Divide, Political Realignment in the Modern Era, featuring Jerry and his guests, associate editor and columnist at the Washington Post, Karen Tumulty. Thank you so much for being here. There are a couple of special groups in the audience tonight. Our audiences are always special, but a couple of groups of folks who aren't typically with us gathered. One is our board of advisors, and there are several members here this evening. If you would raise your hand so we can clap and recognize you for your service, thank you. And then we also have many members of our Student Advisory Board Alumni Committee, a new group in which some of you may be aware that the SAB Alumni, Student Advisory Board Alumni Group, is going to turn 20 a year from now. That is an exceptional tradition that we have here at the Dole Institute, and we are putting new effort into contacting and keeping track of hundreds of graduates of here at the Dole Institute. So anyone who's a Student Advisory Board alumnus in the audience, will you hold your hand up and wave so we can thank you for being with us. Before I hand it over to Jerry and Karen, I want to mention a few upcoming programs. On Wednesday, October 23rd at 4 p.m., we will welcome back Fall 2024 fellow lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star, Jonathan Shorman, who will host the final installment of his discussion group series. He will welcome Wall Street Journal reporter Natalie Andrews and Kansas State University professor Nathaniel Burkhead for a look at the major themes driving House and Senate races across the country this election cycle. The following day, on Thursday, October 24th at 4 p.m. here, a week from this evening, we will be awarding the 2024 Dole Leadership Prize. The honoree this year is the late Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. We are pleased to host her eldest son, Scott O'Connor, who will be appearing also with iCivics CEO Louise Dubé. Some of you may know that Justice O'Connor in her retirement founded the online civics education portal opportunity called iCivics, and we are recognizing her service and legacy, and that still lives today. So we look forward to seeing you in a week here at the Institute to celebrate her service. And then on Monday, October 29th, this is a little different time at 10 a.m. for those of you who have some flexibility in your schedule and are able to join us in the morning. This season's program, in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center of DC, How to Make Congress Work for the American People. We'd love to know what that is. We'll welcome BPC's Michael Thorning, who's the Director of Structural Democracy, and J.D. Racky, who's a Senior Policy Analyst for Structural Democracy. We'll discuss the mechanisms by which American governmental institutions might be more efficient in meeting the needs of its citizens. So we look forward to that. Thank you so much for being with us again tonight. I am now, please join me in welcoming and passing the floor over to Jerry and Karen.
Thank you, Audrey. Is this okay? Yes. Okay. I always tell people the Dole Institute stands for bipartisan conversation, and it's just been proven. You're going to have a Kansas State University professor here next week. So, I mean, there's the proof. So anyway, and I want to thank Karen for being here. Karen is the most perceptive political columnist in Washington, also a very good friend. And I want you all to know, she went through travel hell to get here today. I won't name names, but a certain airline and a certain car rental company did not do their jobs, and it culminated in her getting a rental car that had no air in the tires. So let's start by giving her a round of applause for persevering.
Thank you. I'm just so honored to be here. This is the first time I've been at the Dole Institute, but I came to Washington and for years covered Congress, and as you know, anyone who had been covering Congress in that time really admired Senator Dole, and you know, just the art of legislating that he was capable of and getting things done, and so it's a real honor to be here. I've been very much looking forward to it, although at times today it did look like I wouldn't get here.
So we're going to talk about the way the changing shape of the two parties is affecting this year's election. But let's start by setting down a baseline on where things actually stand. I think you and I have talked about this in the last couple of days, and I think we're in agreement that in the presidential race, Kamala Harris had an amazing consolidation of support and rise in July and August. But that seems to have plateaued a little bit now, and she hasn't pulled away in any of the key swing states. She's underperforming Joe Biden among the Black and Hispanic communities, and Republicans seem to be turning out lots of voters in key states to register at least. So it looks like it's a dead even race. Is that how you see it at this point?
Yeah, it's sort of like the race has gone back to being what it always was, and in the end, it's going to be decided in 7 states and probably by fewer than 70,000 voters. I mean, that's a relative, not even that big of a college football stadium. And, you know, the rest of us are just spectators in this election. We've just never seen, I don't think our democracy has ever seen it this close and in so few places.
And for 3 cycles in a row, really.
Right, but getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, you've been out in Wisconsin, for example. People seem very locked in. We did a Wall Street Journal poll of swing states last week, and the entire universe of undecided voters was 6%. And the entire universe of people who our pollsters classified as persuadable, which means they may change their mind between now and the election, or they haven't decided, is only 16%. Are people as locked in as those numbers suggest? Does it seem that way to you?
Very much so. I mean, anybody who at this point hasn't made up their mind is generally somebody who has been incredibly disengaged from the whole process. It's disproportionately young men, if you look down into the numbers, but there are so few people left to persuade that it really is, it's a cliche that it all comes down to turnout, but it really does. And nobody knows exactly how turnout is going to work. When I was in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, I spent a lot of time talking to Democrats who run the state, and they were pointing out that 4 years ago, in going into the 2020 election, their internal polling numbers in Wisconsin had Biden up by 4, which was a pretty comfortable margin. Come election day, Republicans just came out of everywhere. Wisconsin has same-day voter registration. So these were Republicans that nobody saw coming. They weren't in anybody's voter files, and it ended up an election that they thought was going to be a 4-point spread. Biden still won it, but by less than a point. So nobody knows if that is going to happen again, or if these Trump voters are, exhausted or unmotivated. The same thing, by the way, happened to Hillary Clinton in Florida in 2016. Her numbers looked good. Barack Obama had won the state twice. She had a ground operation. Donald Trump had nothing. But come election day, he won the state. I mean, it was just, nobody knows.
Yeah, and polling doesn't find those things. I mean, it just doesn't tell you those kinds of intangibles. It also occurs to me that one of the reasons this race is so tight, and this gets to our broader subject tonight, is the way the two parties have kind of shifted and changed places in many ways. I mean, Kamala Harris is getting enormous support in Arizona, for example, among college-educated Republicans, college-educated, higher-income people who used to be Republicans. Donald Trump is winning working-class votes in all these swing states. Those used to be Democrats. Talk about how the changing shape of the parties affects the way we have to think about this.
Well, the other thing, by the way, he is doing better with is blacks and Latinos, and especially black and Latino men. And the Trump people have told me that they think it's within their grasp to get 20% of the black vote. And nationally. And some of the polls suggest that could be close. I'm still skeptical, but they said if they get 20% of the black vote, it's game over. So yeah, the parties are shifting around. We have an enormous gender gap this year, but we've had an enormous gender gap for the last few cycles. But it's really interesting. You go and you look at the gender gap. The big differences between men and women are among the very young, where young women are leaning heavily Democratic and young men are more Republican than they have been, and older voters. The gender gap has opened up. So you are seeing voters shifting in ways that we haven't seen before, at least in modern times. And again, nobody knows where they're going to land.
And do you think this shifting is happening because of issues or because of attitudes? In other words, is this about what is Kamala Harris or the Democrats, what do they stand for? Or is this about, this is who I identify with?
Well, part of it is sort of values and tribalism. But part of it, I think, too, is I think COVID really changed a lot of people's perceptions of the stability of their own economic situation. I mean, especially you look at the blacks and Latinos. I mean, they were not generally working in jobs where you could just stay home and work from behind your computer screen. And, economically, they were traumatized. And I think that, it's a lot of this is some of the hangover of what the country has been through in the last 4 years.
Well, and plus, I think that, in that kind of environment, you have an inflation overlay. And I think one of the things that I've observed over time, and you have to be of a certain age to remember this, you have to have been around in the 70s and early 80s, inflation is just an insidious force, and it is an absolute incumbent killer. And I don't think that was fully appreciated going into this cycle. But that's what the numbers keep telling me. Inflation is getting better, it is going down, it is being tamed, but people don't believe it. And it is completely bipartisan and universal. Everybody feels it. And I think that is a huge problem and a drag, and maybe one that was underappreciated at the start of the cycle.
And the thing about inflation that's different from, say, economic growth is that, yes, inflation can come down some, but those prices are still
Right.
pretty high.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I mean, for a while the Democrats kept trying to say, but we're doing better than any other country in the world. And I'm sorry, but people going to the voting booth are not going to say, you know, isn't it great we're doing better than the Germans?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you know, I think the reality is that unemployment affects a small percentage of the population. Economic growth is kind of invisible. Inflation affects everybody every day, and you can't get around it. And I think that neither candidate has exactly offered up a very precise prescription about what they're going to do about inflation. But that doesn't matter because you blame the party in power, and that happens to be the Democrats.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the gender gap. You know, certainly the Democrats have done a great job of pulling women into the party. Abortion as an issue has pulled a lot of women into the party. Are those permanent moves, do you think? Has it changed the character of the Democratic Party and changed the gender balance in the Democratic Party, or do you think it's a temporary situation?
You know, I think that it's probably, well, I mean, here I am in Kansas. So I don't know that, I don't feel like anything is permanent these days.
Yeah. I mean, you saw it here because in the abortion referendum 2 years ago, I mean, women coming out of the woodwork to vote. I don't know that they're aligned or that they can be re-energized, but they certainly showed up in that moment, and that's, I assume, what Kamala Harris has to hope for at this point.
But so Gallup did a poll. I promised myself I wasn't going to quote poll numbers, and here I am doing it. But Gallup had a really interesting one a couple of weeks ago, where they gave people a list of 12 different issues and asked them to rank: is this extremely important, important to your vote, not important? And the economy was cited as extremely important by 53% of the people they surveyed. It was the only issue that got more than half of people saying it was extremely important. And Gallup said that is the most intensity that they have seen on the economy like this since 2008, when, you know, the financial collapse had just happened and, you know, the economy was circling the drain. Abortion in that survey at least came in at number 9.
But at the same time, though, we have consistently in the Wall Street Journal poll been asking people a question all year long, which is, first we ask rank your issues, and it's always economy, immigration, and then abortion somewhere lower. But then we ask a question about dispositive issues, which is to say, sometimes you will simply not vote for somebody who disagrees with you on an issue because that issue is so important to you. Tell me if there's an issue like that for you. And abortion is far and away the biggest issue. That is a vote stopper. In other words, I will never vote for somebody who disagrees with me on abortion, even if you say the economy is more important to me.
And interestingly, when you used to ask that question, the people who answered that were always pro-life.
Yeah.
And this now, that's not the case.
So let me go back to one of the constituencies where Trump has done well, which is working class voters, particularly working class men, and ask you a question about what you've seen over time, which is, how did Democrats lose their hold on those guys? And we're talking about guys.
You know, that is such a good question, because as recently as, you know, Barack Obama did pretty well with them. I think in part it does come down to values, to just people who don't feel they're being listened to, that their problems are really truly being addressed, that they are being sort of sidelined. And
but does that mean they're being sidelined in politics or in life and the economy more generally?
Well, so if you go back to 2010, Nancy Pelosi, you know, that's when the Democrats lost the House, one of the several times since then. And Nancy Pelosi said that, I said, well, that was health care, wasn't it? And she says, no. She said she thought the way the government responded to the financial collapse, really, you know, it was like, we'll take care of Wall Street, we'll take care of the automakers, but you can go ahead and lose your house. And so there is a sense that Washington is always taking care of other people, but not me. And so you saw that rising up in the Tea Party movement. I think Donald Trump saw what was going on there. One of the times I interviewed him was, believe it or not, 6 days after Mitt Romney lost in 2012. The Republican Party was completely traumatized. They thought they were going to win that race. Reince Priebus, the chairman of the RNC, commissions this big autopsy report. They're like, oh, we have to be, more inclusive and soften our edges. 6 days into that, one Donald J. Trump writes a $325 check and sends it into the Patent and Trademark Office and trademarks the phrase, "Make America Great Again." And if you go on the Patent and Trademark Office website to this day, you will see those block letters are exactly the way they look on the hat. And, Trump told me that he decided 2 days after the 2012 election that he was going to run, but he clearly saw something out there that other people didn't.
Well, and he interestingly made a decision at that point to run against the Democrats, but against his own Republican Party.
Right.
And the leadership of that party, which he thought was basically brain dead at that point.
And then we get to 2016, and I thought he didn't have a ghost of a chance of getting the nomination, because you would look up on that Republican debate stage, and it was 16 or 17 of the most credentialed people ever to stand together on a debate stage.
The best Republican field ever assembled in my experience.
Yes, senators, governors, business executives, you name it, they were all there, and he just swept it. Yeah,
he absolutely did. So that raises a question about, in terms of the changing shape of the parties, two traditional Republican constituencies, ideological conservatives and the business community. Where do they go in this alignment? Is there any home for them right now?
To me, it doesn't quite feel that way, but you do get a sense that a lot of people are just kind of, crossing their fingers and saying, well, he will cut my taxes, and, I'm just going to hope that the rest of that stuff doesn't happen. The tariffs, we're talking Smoot-Hawley territory.
Yeah, and you can take a poll of the Fortune 500 companies, and you're not going to find a lot of support for that. But they still pony up money and support for Donald Trump. I guess, as you say, they think they're going to get their tax cuts and hope the rest of it goes away. A lot of people thought, because of this dissatisfaction with the two parties and the candidates, that this would be the year that an independent or third-party candidate might actually take hold. And it looked briefly as if it might, perhaps in the person of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And now it seems to be what we see every 4 years. It's dissipating. Why? Why is it not the case that this third lane can be carved out in a system in which there's so much unhappiness with both parties?
But I think third-party candidates don't have the infrastructure. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of organization in our two-party system. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. turned out to be a wackadoodle, but
It's a technical political term.
But I do wonder if a Ross Perot type were to come along today, what he or she might be able to do.
But if the structural problems are so enormous, maybe that doesn't really matter.
Right. No third-party candidate, I think, has won an electoral vote since George Wallace.
Yeah. So let's talk about where the election is going to be decided. And I made no pledge about not citing poll numbers here, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. So the Wall Street Journal, did a poll last week of the 7 swing states, the ones that everybody refers to: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And here's what we have. We have Harris up by 2 in Arizona, Trump up by 2 in Georgia. No, let me back up. Harris up by 2 in Arizona, Harris up by 2 in Georgia, Harris up by 2 in Michigan, Trump up by 1 in North Carolina, Trump up by 6 in Nevada, Trump up by 1 in Pennsylvania, and Harris up by 1 in Wisconsin. That's tied. In 7 straight states.
Except
basically.
I would assume, with the exception of that Nevada number, it's within the margin of error.
Yeah, and even the Nevada one is, but barely, although that surprises me a little bit, and maybe we can talk about that a bit. But it also tells you that the path for her to win is pretty narrow. There's a much bigger red block of states that he can count on. There's a blue block of states that she can count on. Tell me how that feels in a place like, let's say for Wisconsin, because you've been there recently. How does that feel in a swing state? Are people inundated? Are they tuning in or are they tuning out?
Oh yeah, it's just, you cannot get away from the ads. You cannot get away from the conversations. And it's mostly, you can't get away from the anxiety.
The anxiety
about just everybody is just so on edge about all of this. But Wisconsin's also sort of interesting because they've got a senator up for re-election, Tammy Baldwin, who wasn't expected to be having much of a difficult race. And all of a sudden, she's tied. I mean, they could lose Wisconsin. They could lose that Senate seat. You know, and I do wonder, you know, if that's what turns out to happen on election night, you know, what the heck is Chuck Schumer doing spending money in Texas and Florida?
Yeah, well, I mean, Texas is, as we've discussed, Texas is the perennial Lucy in the football for Democrats.
Oh, it's fool's gold.
I think we're going to get it. I think we're finally going to get it. But let's talk about those Senate seats then. So one of the things I wrote about in the piece that's been it's going to be published on Saturday. That's up online now. Is the faint re-emergence of ticket splitters, which is to say people who will vote one way in the presidential race and another way down ballot in a Senate or a House race. And Democrats probably better hope that's true in places like Montana and Ohio. Do you think, well, talk about the races that will determine who controls the Senate, for starters.
Well, there's a handful of them. I mean, I think right now it's really hard to really believe a scenario that the Democrats hang on. And so you're talking about what? Ohio, Montana. Who would have thought Wisconsin would have been in there?
West Virginia is gone for the Democrats. I think everybody agrees on that.
Which is so interesting. West Virginia, within my lifetime at least, my adulthood, used to be one of the bluest states in the country. It voted for Dukakis. Nobody voted for Dukakis. And just to watch how, over really a relatively short number of years, Ohio used to be a swing state. Florida used to be a swing state. And just, you know, it's with dizzying speed that we've seen these states move into different columns.
So people do seem willing to support a Senate candidate of one party and a presidential candidate of another party. Do you think they're doing that for tactical reasons? Are they trying to make sure power is split up in Washington, or is it more instinctive than that?
I'm still a little skeptical it actually will happen. 2016, I think, was the first year ever where there was not a single state in the country where there was a Senate race going on and the presidential race, and the voters didn't go the same direction in both of them. I think there was one difference in 2020. So politics has just become so tribal. I mean, that's what's killing John Tester in Montana. People like him there. They know him. But it is just such a red state. I mean, it's why Joe Manchin became the last Democrat who could possibly win in West Virginia, and he stepped out. I mean, in Texas, no Democrat has won any statewide office in Texas since 1994.
It's amazing, because it used to be the exact opposite. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the broader attitude of the country, but before we get to that, there's some students here tonight, and one thing I know they're curious about is our business, the business of journalism. You know, the political system is under a lot of strain, but so is the world of journalism. There's less trust in us than there used to be. There is a lot of competition for mainstream news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post that didn't used to exist. Audiences are splintered. How do you think we're doing? By we, I mean journalists. And how are our institutions holding up?
Not well. And the other thing that you didn't mention is the death of local journalism. And there have been studies done. I know a big one out of the University of Chicago, looking at the relationship of political polarization and local news. People would trust their local news outlets in a way I think they don't trust the rest of us. But once that local news goes away, then they start just going into their red and blue silos. And that's part of the problem, is that people are living in their own self-reinforcing environments. And we're all under financial stress. It's, ad revenues have died in part because of technology. It's like, do you want to put your kids, you want to sell a car, do you want to put it in the classifieds, or do you want to have Google come to you and tell you they can give you 50,000 people between the ages of 25 and 40 who've searched for a Toyota in the last, 2 weeks? Yeah. So we're under stress from that. And basically, all of us are working on, and the other place that a lot of our traffic was coming from on the web was search. Well, AI is going to take care of that. So basically, we are all trying to retool our products to be something that people will pay for. And the smart executives in our business made a massive mistake in the 90s by giving it away for free. And now trying to get people to pay for something that they think they can get for free is really hard.
But in this difficult transition are the standards that I think you and I grew up with in journalism, which, objectivity, fairness, balance, kind of moderation of tone. Are those things, can those things be held, or are we losing those things because of this environment that we're talking about?
I think they're gone. I think people have, it's gotten to the point where people select the medium that reinforces what they already believe. And then the algorithm feeds them more of that. And I do think, objectivity, there's a huge debate. There's a generation of journalists coming up, I don't know if in your newsroom, who think objectivity is not the desirable standard.
Well, and more than that, some will tell you it's not even possible to be objective.
Right.
And then you've lost the battle because you've given up before the fight even starts, so, in my opinion. So I think that's. Can we pull out of this stage that we're in? I mean, will good journalism win out in the long run, which is what I tell people usually?
Ultimately, I think one thing we have to do is show our work. If you assert something, you need to sort of put the data out there so that a reader who's engaged enough can go and decide for themselves if what you're asserting is actually true. And technology makes that possible. But we are swimming against the tide because news has become so siloed. I mean, my Facebook feed is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to predict the outcome of the election because, well, in fact, we should talk a little bit about how nobody can predict the outcome of the election. But I do want to talk about the future a little bit. So, at the end of the day, tell us what you're going to be watching to figure out who is going to win this election. Which voter groups, which states, what vibe is going to matter the most in the last 2.5 weeks, which is what we're down to.
Well, God willing that the election is over with soon after Election Day.
Yeah.
Because, this could drag on for weeks, and it will become extremely toxic and dangerous if it does. If people somehow think they should have their results on election night and, counting fast is more important than counting carefully. But what am I watching? You know, in 2016, we had a pretty clear idea when Florida and North Carolina went.
Yeah.
But it's just, I don't know how early we're going to be seeing any of this, and how much of this is going to be under all kinds of challenge.
And do you think in the swing states, is there possible there's going to be a wave, or are they all going to break independently? Especially if you look at where everybody's focus is, a lot of focus is, which is the upper tier of the Midwest, Pennsylvania to Michigan to Wisconsin, they usually all go the same direction. Yeah. So I think once we know, especially Pennsylvania, I mean, that's the big kahuna of this election. So if you have a sense of what the upper Midwest tier is moving, then you'll probably know the answer to the question. And in fact, if she wins those three, it's over there. And if she doesn't win Pennsylvania, then it's a difficult proposition of putting together Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, some combination of less attractive states from her campaign's point of view. But I do think we're going to see more conformity among these swing states than less. So another question I get asked frequently, casting forward, is what happens to the Republican Party if Donald Trump doesn't win? Does it snap back to what it used to be in the days of Bush and Reagan and Romney? Or does it remain in the Trump mold? Or is it a civil war? What's your guess? Number 2 or number 3. Yeah. Because there are now so many Trump mini-me's out there, starting with J.D. Vance. If Trump goes, there are a lot of people who have styled themselves in his image, and they're all going to be, I think, stepping up. So you've because it's not likely to be a Goldwater level defeat. Yeah, there's not a big wave on either side developing. Right. At least it doesn't feel that way. Right. So you've already said it's very tough for the Democrats to hold the Senate. What about the House? I think that is right now a real coin flip. And interestingly enough, it's the House. Some of the Senate races are in the same states as the presidential swing states. The House, the races that are going to determine the House, interestingly enough, are disproportionately in very blue states. There's a bunch of them in California and a bunch of them in New York. So they're going to be operating on a completely different rhythm. Which is just bizarre, because there was never a time in my life or yours, I think, where you said, the control of the House is going to be determined in New York and California. Those were reliably blue states. The fight was someplace else. But the world has changed. And if the Democrats can win back some of those blue seats in New York, then they get back the House. But the point I was driving to is this. We're talking about a scenario here in which it's possible every part of the government changes hands in November. The White House could change hands, the Senate could change hands, and the House could change hands. And if the Senate and the House go 2 different directions, a double flip, they're calling it, that will be the first time that has ever happened in American history, and it's very possible. Probably, I would say likely. So then the question is, how can you govern under those conditions, where you have a brand new Senate, a brand new House, and Donald Trump returns to the White House? I don't know about you, but I have a hard time picturing a smooth governing, a smooth functioning machine emerging from that scenario. But also if Kamala Harris gets elected. Okay. If she gets elected with a Republican Senate, which seems like the most likely situation, how is she going to get her nominees through for anything? And if, the House then, if it were to go Democratic, that would be sort of the only tool she would have. And not a very strong tool in this environment in which everything is divided on a razor's edge. So governing is going to be difficult. That's the one thing we can predict with certainty here tonight. Right. Good. I want to turn to audience questions here in a minute, but... Have we depressed you enough yet? I found reasons for optimism in this piece that's online, so go read it. Keeping up on the depression tour here, let me ask you this. So 2 years ago, pollsters that you and I both know, Neil Newhouse, who's a Republican, and Joel Benenson, who's a Democrat, did a survey and they found that 61% of Republicans said the Democratic agenda is a threat that will destroy the country if not stopped. And 57% of Democrats thought the same thing about Republicans. So how does this cycle end? How do we get out of this period in which people think the other side is not just wrong, but evil and an actual threat to the country's survivability?
I think that is the big question. And I remember, for instance, when Barack Obama was running in 2012, and the phrase he used to use a lot was break the fever, that if he got reelected, it would break the fever. And he gets reelected, and 3 years later, Donald Trump comes down the escalator. So I don't know. I keep thinking this. The system is, something's got to give, but I don't know what that would be.
Yeah.
And the thing that no longer exists is either side thinking that there's victory in compromise. Kathleen Sebelius is sitting there. You saw everything it took to get the Affordable Care Act over, even though it passed with Democratic votes. Just sort of bringing in all these constituencies, and you just don't see that effort anymore.
Maybe it's not possible, or maybe there's just no Bob Dole out there. Is there one out there that I'm missing?
Not that I can see.
Exactly.
If there is, he's going to be drummed out of the leadership of his party.
Yeah, exactly. Well, just for what it's worth, this piece I've done for the Journal, I talk about positive signs include the fact that turnout is way up, and at least people are engaged. Maybe they're engaged for the wrong reasons, but at least they're not apathetic. And you do have some return of ticket splitting. And there is this phenomenon now which citizens actually are funding campaigns, not PACs or sort of invisible big organizations, but a lot of citizens are funding campaigns. And once people in the center figure out how to work that system better, then maybe there's some reason to think it'll pull people back toward the center a little bit. And you just need some models. You need somebody to show that you can succeed in the center.
But I'm also a big fan of election reform. I like ranked choice voting. It's a little complicated, but I do think that it encourages people to sort of look beyond their own little base and try to appeal to people who are not necessarily their natural constituency. I think that that gerrymandering is overblown as an evil because it doesn't really explain why the Senate is so polarized. But I do think that, if this was turned over to independent commissions, we'd be healthier.
Well, there are 5 states that have non-partisan primary votes now. There are 4 more, I don't think people have focused on this, that are going to be voting on ballot initiatives in November that would turn their states into non-partisan primaries. And I agree with you. I think that has the potential to really take some of the partisanship out of the House in particular.
Although Alaska did it, and they have a ballot initiative that would
turn it around. Yeah, so does Louisiana. So we'll see. I want to open it up to your questions. There's a very wide field to play on here. So if you want to raise your hand, I'll call and wait for somebody to come around with a microphone. We'll start right there. And if you'll stand up so we can see and hear better, that would be awesome.
Okay. Can you explain what's going on with Nebraska and their one vote?
Go ahead.
Well, I actually wish more states would do what Nebraska and Maine do as well, which is it's not winner take all on the electoral votes. It's per congressional district. And I think if every state did it that way, say you're a Republican, you can't win California, but maybe you can go and win part of the Central Valley. And so Nebraska does have one, it's a very red state, but it has one district in Omaha that can trend blue. So it is possible that Kamala Harris could pick up one electoral vote out of Nebraska And there are also scenarios, believe it or not, where the whole election comes down to Omaha.
It's not it is not a far-fetched scenario. Go on the electoral map and do the math, and you can construct a scenario in which that single congressional district in Omaha, as you say, tips the balance. It takes one side or the other from 269 to 270.
But do you agree with me it'd be better if more states did that?
Yeah, I mean, it would force candidates to move out into places in the country where they aren't seen and where people feel like they're simply ignored. So I think by the way, there's an interesting thing going on in Nebraska, which is there's actually a competitive Senate race underway, which is amazing, actually. There used to be that Nebraska elected Democrats, Bob Kerrey and the like, but it's been a long time. Now there's an independent/Democratic candidate who seems to be making a serious run. And that would get some people's attention. Who else? Right there?
Maynard Olivarius, Lawrence, thank you for being here and for what you're saying tonight. You've sort of posed the question to each other, where does this go, where does it end, what happens? Should Trump get elected and he implements Project 2025, speak to what that does to how it might evolve or end.
I'll let you go first.
Trump says he has had nothing to do with it, and but the fact is it was put together by a lot of people who do have connections to Trump. But I do think that this has been a great campaign tool for the Democrats, but some of these ideas in there are so radical and we have not seen any in a Trump White House the competence level to implement a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the ability to push ideas like that over the line, whether you like them or you don't like them, the ability in a very divided environment in which, as Karen so artfully put it, the competence of the Trump White House last time around to push a policy agenda into place was limited.
Infrastructure week.
Yeah, infrastructure, 4 years of infrastructure week. They never managed to get it done. I suspect a lot of that just falls by the wayside. This is different. Like when we both I entered the picture when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and the Heritage Foundation did a very similar thing. It was called Mandate for Leadership. It was a very thick book. I still have a copy of it at home, of things that ought to happen with Reagan wins. And they went through and implemented a lot of that pretty methodically. But you had a White House that was manned by people like Jim Baker, who knew what they were doing and knew how to get things done. And the ideas weren't as radical as this. So, I am skeptical that a whole lot of that agenda is ever going to see light of day, even if Trump wins. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Right there.
I thank you for being here today. Charlie Crabtree here in Lawrence. Would both of you try to explain, if you can, why so many people across the country seem to be completely ignoring character, truthfulness, lawfulness? They seem to be completely ignoring that in favor of I don't know what.
Fire away.
It's not only ignoring it, but, and I think, again, we're talking Exhibit A here in Mar-a-Lago. There are people who like that, who, what most people would call character flaws, there are people who are energized by the things he says. I mean, that's why, and what we're seeing in the final few weeks of this campaign is he is just doubling down on being as divisive as he possibly can. And that's what I don't understand is, I can see people saying, well, my retirement account is safe, but that's not what happens with Trump. There are people who are enthused by this, who just love it. I mean, I've spent a lot of time at Trump rallies, which is the dancing thing the other day didn't surprise or shock me quite as much as other people. There's a lot of dancing at Trump rallies.
Yeah. I think Karen made an important point that it's not because people don't recognize character flaws in somebody. I think they've decided they don't care, and this is a huge change. I mean, everybody remembers Gary Hart and the whole scenario in which one little, not even much of an indiscretion was enough to blow up the whole campaign. When character did matter versus now, where it doesn't seem. But I think it's a conscious choice that people have made, that we want somebody who's tough and who's a fighter, and that's what Donald Trump is. And it doesn't matter what his character is. What matters is he that kind of guy? And he is that kind of guy, and maybe the fact that he has what some people would see as character flaws, I think, are a plus, because it means he'll throw caution to the winds and be a tough guy.
And also this feeling like he's not afraid to say what he thinks, and he won't get pushed around. That, at least, is what I've heard from Trump. And then there's this whole other thing of he didn't mean it that way.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that. And I think the one thing you cannot say anymore, this is 9 years after he came down the escalator, is that if people only understood Donald Trump, they'd think differently about him. Well, I mean, what can you tell anybody, and this is a problem in our profession actually, what can you tell anybody about Donald Trump that they don't already know? Not much. So this is a conscious choice that people are making, and they've thought it through because they've had 9 years to think it through, and that's where they land. So I think
It's because I'm constantly getting pounded by our liberal readers with like, why don't you tell people he's a criminal? Why don't you? And you're just like, I'm sorry. People see it, they hear it, and some people like it.
Yeah.
And I mean, at the Republican convention, some of the hottest selling T-shirts were "I'm voting for the felon."
Yeah. Yeah.
What has changed our country so much?
Well, we were talking about this a little bit before, and I'll start here, but you should pick up. I think we're in a period of disillusionment. Trust in institutions is declining. All institutions. Used to be the Supreme Court and the military were out there as exceptions, and they're not anymore. So we're in an age of disillusionment. I think that people have legitimate reasons to be disillusioned with government. I mean, you have a government in Washington that's failed to deal with the immigration problem. It has failed to deal with a deficit that has just exploded in the last 20 years, and nobody seems to even care about it. As Karen said, there was a financial crisis in 2002 and 2008, and the Wall Street guys got bailed out, and you lost your house, and that doesn't go down particularly well. And you've had two essentially failed wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan, that both dragged on for almost a decade. So, I think people look at that and they say, well, it's not working for me. So I think it has produced a kind of a disillusionment, and then Donald Trump arrived and turned that disillusionment into anger, and here we are. That's my 30-second analysis.
And some of these swing states where the election's going to be decided is where you have most, big concentrations of these people who feel like they've been left behind and that government takes care of other people, not them.
Right, and by the way, I would also add, and I don't necessarily agree with this, I'm just describing an attitude. We had a whole period in which both parties decided they fell in love with free trade. They came together and passed NAFTA, and a lot of people in these swing states saw industries flattened, and they remember that. So I think those are the reasons, and some of them are exaggerated and some of them are illegitimate possibly, but I think it's not coming out of nowhere, right? I think that we would agree on that. Yeah.
We have a virtual question from a Clay Barker. Regarding the assertion that Trump has captured the Republican Party, can you compare Kansas to other states? In Kansas, populists control about half the state party, precinct leaders, state committee, etc. But populists have comprehensively failed to win any Republican primary elections for the state legislature, which remains solidly old school, pro-business, conservative. Thank you.
I should ask Kathleen to answer this question. Well, here's my quick analysis. I think there's always been a populist strain in Kansas. It's never been very far beneath the surface. I think that's been kind of married with a Trump strain in Kansas that seems to control the Republican Party right now. But I think these things go in cycles and then go in phases. And I think the interesting question to me is whether Republicans in Kansas, whether the traditional kind of Jan Myers, Bob Dole,
Nancy
Kassebaum Republican Party still exists, and I think it probably still does. It's just been kind of, it's been sat upon by a different kind of Republican Party. But I think that's probably true in a lot of states, don't you think?
Yeah, and also if you look, there's so many states where the state level Republican Party official machinery has just gone completely bonkers. You know, it's gotten to the point where it's like not even functional. I mean, you look at someplace like Arizona, and you know, there in many places the Republican Party machinery is at war with the Republican governor.
And the Democrats may very well win a Senate race in Arizona precisely because of that. So anyway, I think we're in a cycle. We're in a phase right now. But this goes back to the question I asked you before. In a post-Trump era, does the old conservative Republican Party snap back? And I don't think so, not right away.
Not right away.
But maybe eventually, but not right away. Others? Right there, and then we'll go here next.
Hi. You mentioned how, like, in this era of polarization, it's so hard for either side to see compromise as a win. Like, we can't find a new Bob Dole in legislation. Do you think that's, like, trying to, like, mend those bridges? Does that start first with politicians in office, or does that start with voters first?
I think it totally starts with voters. I mean, they're the ones who are sending these people to Washington. And if you just look at the House of Representatives and that whole crazy, however many weeks it was, where they kicked out Kevin McCarthy and they were just going through, and you know, you had like 5 or 6 members of the Freedom Caucus who were just rejecting one candidate after another because they were afraid they might compromise on something.
Yeah. No, I think this is a really good question because I think voters have to take some responsibility for what they produced, you know, in both parties. And voters can make statements, and politicians are like Pavlov's dog. You know, you ring the bell, they'll respond. But they're responding to different kinds of signals now than the ones you suggest. So, I think we had a question here, and then I'll go way to the back after that.
Hi, Tim Quinn. Thank you for the presentation. It was great. I've read some things recently about a kind of new special interest or a new group, and the way you talked about the polling and what the concern is may throw some soda at it, but it's basically the Girl Dad Coalition, which are the fathers of girls that may be influenced by the Dobbs decision, and they seem to be picking up momentum in certain states. Would that be enough of an issue, you think, to drive the turnout to the polls in that regard?
You know, I just don't know how big that is as a movement. And, you know, so, and I think probably it's more important in some places than in others.
You know, I guess my reaction would be that I suspect that phenomenon exists for sure. And if you're talking about an election in which the entire national election is decided, as Karen said at the outset, by 70,000 votes in a country of 300 million, every movement in the margins matters. So, yeah, I mean, I would say yeah, because it doesn't take much, right? A few votes here, a few votes here, there, and that's what we're probably looking at this year. So, I will say that's a brand new phenomenon. So, hold on. Oh, Jim, go ahead. Okay, let's do that one here, and then Jim, you're going to get the final word because we're almost out of time.
Hi.
Final. Okay.
Thank you both for holding this panel tonight. We talked a little bit today about the polling, and a recent New York Times CNN poll said that over 1/3 of the Republican parties believes that the 2020 election was stolen. There have been election denialists in several different races. J.D. Vance refuses to acknowledge that Trump lost the 2020 election. And the Republican Party has a real opportunity to hold a majority in all 3 branches of government. That being said, how does the American democracy look like, or what does it look like if the Republican Party holds all three branches of government?
Yeah, the election denialism is really disturbing. I mean, because court case after court case after court case, was thrown out. But I do think some of these people in their heart of hearts say that because it's a political signifier. It's the tribal chant. And so they just don't want to see evidence, they don't want to hear evidence, and I don't even know that they necessarily believe it.
And I would just add that one of the encouraging things, to me at least, is that institutions are holding. I mean, you saw it this week in Georgia, where a judge in Georgia blocked the effort by the state's election board to mandate that every vote in Georgia, and by the way, that's 5 million votes, had to be hand counted. And the Republican leadership in the state said, that's crazy, we shouldn't do that. And a judge said, you're right, you can't do that overnight, and it's not going to happen that way. So you've had election officials hold their ground, you've had courts hold their ground, and as Karen suggests, I'm not sure the sentiment is as widespread as polling might tell you. And by the way, there are more than 1,000 people who've been prosecuted for what happened on January 6th, and that's got to provide some deterrent effect for people who might think that they're going to go out in the streets on November 6th and stir up some trouble. Well, they now can think about whether they want to add to the 1,000 people on January 6th. So I guess my response would be in part that I think institutions are holding so far, and I have to believe they will continue to do that. Jim? Just 1 second, just go wait till the microphone gets to you.
I'm curious, do either of you have any indication that the polling firms have made adjustments to their methodology? They undercounted Trump in 2016, undercounted Trump in 2020. I'm just curious, have they made adjustments that you all have heard about?
They definitely have, and there's one question is whether they've adjusted too far.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the answer, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm familiar with what we do at the Journal, and there's been a lot of adjustment. I mean, it's expensive to poll properly. I mean,
especially because people think we don't go to people's cell phones. We do, and the amount of money it takes to get a sample size that's big enough of people who will actually answer their phones, it's hugely expensive.
So, to get one interview, it takes 200 calls. The response rate is 0.5 percentage point, and that's on landlines or cell. And we now do more than 50% of our polling on cell phones because that's what you have to do to get a representative sample. So it's hard and it's expensive, but we have gone to something called text-to-web polling, which means that instead of me calling Karen and hoping she'll answer the phone and respond to my survey, and she'll probably won't answer her cell phone, she gets a text that said, would you like to go online and answer our survey? And then she's more likely to do that than answer a phone call. So then she does it. And it's not online polling because we know who it is, we know what the cell phone number is, we know what her demographics are from the voter file. And it's a way to capture people that were missed in 2016 and 2020, in 2022 to some extent. But I think Karen made an interesting point. Polling underestimated Trump in 2016 and 2020. It overestimated the red wave for Republicans in 2022. So, it is a problem on both sides right now. And I think people who are doing it right are probably closer. But my last thought is that you have to admit, you have to be humble here in this business in doing polling, because one of the things you try to do is predict what the electorate's going to look like on November 5th, to construct a sample that is representative of what the electorate will be on November 5th. And as Karen was pointing out, who's going to come out of the woodwork? I don't know, and we don't really know. So, Kathleen, go ahead. Yeah, we'll get
a quick follow-up.
1 second. Here it's coming.
What I've heard a lot of people suggest is that because Trump was on the ballot in 16 and again in 20, that some of the low propensity Trump voters are built into the likely voters for 24, right? They know what's not built in to the likely voters in 24 are low propensity women who have showed up in a number of these ballot initiatives. So in Kansas, in August of 22, there were 300,000 people who showed up in August who didn't come back in November. 300,000 votes. And the Secretary of State miraculously didn't put out any voter data soon enough to use it in November. It came out later that year. But that's happened all over the country. In Ohio, in Florida's got an initiative, Nevada's got an initiative, Arizona. Are those voters, do you think, in the likely voters in 24, or do we have any idea who those voters are?
Well, we in our polling have stopped trying to identify likely voters. This is getting a little arcane, but I mean, we don't know what a likely voter is. What you do know is propensity to vote based on past performance. Did you vote in the last 2 or 3? And those are the voters what we've focused on. But that may not be a good indicator either, because if you're motivated by new reasons to vote in 2024 that didn't exist in your mind in 2020 or 2016, then maybe you're not in the polling model. So I think it is a huge mistake to take polls as an indicator of what the exact score of the game is in the bottom of the 7th inning. Because it's not that good. But you're right. I mean, and that's, I think, at the very start of this conversation, at the point you were making, who's going to come out of the woodwork in 2024 among the electorate that we aren't counting on or aren't counting in polls?
And I think the tribalism is such that, you know, I think there's a abortion ballot initiative in Florida. I think there are going to be plenty of women who are Republicans who come out and vote, you know, one way on the initiative and still vote for Republican candidates.
But I will also add, though, the one hard number that you can count on is voter registration. And that's, you mentioned that at the outset as well, that Republicans have done exceptionally well this year in getting people to show up and register to vote. And if you register to vote, you're more likely than not going to vote, and Democrats are behind in that category.
Here are a couple of numbers from Pennsylvania, the big kahuna state. Democratic registration, the edge, the margin. 4 years ago, there were 600,000 plus more Democrats registered Democrats in Pennsylvania than registered Republicans. That number is now down to 300,000. It has been cut in half in the past 4 years. So yeah, the Republicans right now, at least in some places, and we're all only focusing on a few places, they've done a pretty good job of just flat out registering people.
Yeah. Obviously, we could go on, but we're out of time. I will just add that I want to thank you all for showing up, because I think the most important thing in this period that we're in now is citizen engagement. And you all are engaged by virtue of the fact that you're here tonight. I appreciate that. I think that's a healthy sign for all of us. And I want to thank Karen in particular for showing up and helping us think through these interesting but difficult issues. So, Karen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We didn't predict anything. We didn't predict anything.